Amazing Monsters, The Tricky Troggle by Jim Slater, illustrated by Christopher Slater. Very few people like Mr. Grub because he is greedy and unkind to animals. One bright sunny morning, Mr. Grub went for a walk in the woods near his house. He didn't see that the sun was shining, he didn't hear the birds singing, and he didn't smell the beautiful scent of the flowers in the woods. Mr. Grub was thinking of only one thing: how to make more money out of his shop in the village. I know, Mr. Grub thought. I'll raise the prices of cakes, candy, and cookies. No one will notice. I haven't raised them for at least a week. Mr. Grub smiled happily at the thought of making some more money. He was thinking about it so hard that he nearly tripped over a small purple monster lying fast asleep under an oak tree. How can I make some money out of this little monster? Mr. Grub thought. Then he had an idea. He raced back to his house and quickly found a chain and a metal collar with big spikes. It had belonged to his dog, which had died because Mr. Grub hadn't fed it enough. Mr. Grub rushed back to the oak tree and snapped the metal collar around the monster's neck. The monster woke up with a start and opened his bright green eyes. "Get up and follow me," Mr. Grub shouted. "I'm going to make a lot of money out of you." Then he tugged the chain and led the small purple monster back to his garden. Mr. Grub fastened the chain to a big iron ring on the wall of his house. Then he built a high wooden fence all around his garden. "You can see the monster through this little hole," Mr. Grub said to the people from the village. "It will cost you 25 cents for a 1-minute look." "Is it half price for children?" a young girl asked. "No," Mr. Grub replied. Everyone wanted to see the monster, so they paid their 25 cents and had a quick look. During all this time, the purple monster hadn't eaten a single thing. Mr. Grub tried giving him fish, eggs, fruit, vegetables, bread, cakes, and even ice cream, but the monster wouldn't eat a crumb. After 6 months, the monster became very thin, and Mr. Grub began to worry about him. If anything happened to his monster, he would lose the hundreds of quarters people paid him 6 days a week. On Sundays, the little hole was closed. Even Mr. Grub had to have a rest sometimes. Mr. Grub asked Mr. Amazing to come and see him. "You know all about monsters," Mr. Grub said. "I want to know what kind of monster I have in my garden and how to make him eat something." Mr. Amazing spent all day Sunday looking at the monster. "I am amazed," Mr. Amazing said at last. "This is a troggle." "Are troggles worth a lot?" Mr. Grub asked. "Yes," Mr. Amazing replied. "This is the only troggle alive in the world today." Mr. Grub rubbed his hands together and smiled. "Why isn't the troggle eating anything?" Mr. Grub asked. "Don't worry," Mr. Amazing said. "Troggles have only 1 meal a year." "Then he won't cost much to keep," Mr. Grub replied, laughing happily. "I think you should let me take the troggle to the London Zoo," Mr. Amazing said. "They can look after him there, and everyone will be able to come and see him." "No," Mr. Grub snapped. "Anybody who wants to see my troggle has to pay me 25 cents. "I must warn you that troggles can be tricky," Mr. Amazing said. "You shouldn't keep him here." "The troggle is staying in my garden," Mr. Grub shouted. Mr. Amazing shook his head sadly and went back to London. People came to see the troggle from places as far away as Australia and Japan. Sometimes the poor little monster just lay still against the wall of the house. Then Mr. Grub poked the troggle with his walking stick and made him move around the garden. Everyone who came paid 25 cents to see the troggle. Once a week, Mr. Grub changed the coins into dollar bills, which he hid under the floorboards in his bedroom. One Sunday, Mr. Grub went to visit his brother. He left the poor little monster chained up in his garden. Soon after Mr. Grub had gone, the troggle slipped his thin head out of the thick spiked iron collar. He walked over to the house, opened his mouth very wide, and began his first meal of the year. The troggle ate the walls, windows, front door, and roof of the house. Then he started on the rooms. Troggles don't eat metal, so he left some doorknobs and faucets, a kettle, 2 saucepans, and some knives, forks, and spoons. When the troggle came to Mr. Grub's bedroom, he ate the bed, dresser, table, and chair. Then he began to munch through the floorboards. The troggle soon found thousands and thousands of green pieces of paper. "These really are very tasty," the purple monster said to himself. 2 hours later, all Mr. Grub's dollar bills were gone. So were his house and the high wooden fence around his garden. When the Troggle had finished his meal of the year, he licked his lips, smiled, and slowly walked off into the woods. When Mr. Grub came back, in the place where his house used to be, there were just a few doorknobs, saucepans, and other metal things. The spiked collar and chain were lying on the lawn, but there was no sign of the Troggle. Mr. Amazing had tried to warn Mr. Grub that Troggles were tricky, but some people never listen.